Good morning. I'm Brian Curtis. Here are the stories we're following today. The major topic of U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East today was the possibility of some sort of pause in the region, along with the fact that it looks like the war is widening in the Middle East. Ed Baxter is covering this story and has more from San Francisco. Ed?
Yeah, let's start with the widening. Israel's military says it's exchanging fire with Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israeli troops encircled Gaza. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has finished that part of his trip in Turkey.
We've engaged the Israelis on steps that they can take to minimize civilian casualties. We're working, as I said, very aggressively on getting more humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and we have very concrete ways of doing that. And I think you'll see in the days ahead that assistance can expand in significant ways.
And has talked about tactical pauses. That is what the U.S. is calling them. And it says that President Biden has talked with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today about how to do that. The United Nations has issued an emergency appeal for $1.2 billion in funding to maintain humanitarian support for Palestinians in Gaza. But U.S. diplomacy has not ended with Blinken leaving for Asia. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern.
Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, is also in Israel today and is going to be traveling throughout the region. So clearly what you see from this administration is, one, they want to make sure humanitarian aid is getting into Gaza, and at the same time, they also want to make sure that this conflict is not spread throughout the region. And
Anne-Marie says the White House maintains the president's military aid to Israel may double its Iron Dome arsenal. That is the $14 billion aid request. Latest reports are that deaths have passed 10,000 on the Gaza Strip. Donald Trump on the stand today in his New York fraud trial. The issue whether he inflated his wealth to get better terms from lenders and insurers. Bloomberg legal editor Tony Lynn says Trump came out swinging from the start.
We've often seen, once people are under oath, they'll take a more measured sort of approach. His sons, for instance, when they testified, they were sort of much more moderate in tone than I guess some of the rhetoric they've said. But I think Trump has not, didn't mince any words in terms of how he feels about this proceeding.
And Tony said they really didn't seem to get a lot out of it.
Towards the end, the judge put it well. He said it was essentially the broken record, he called it. He repeated sort of a lot of his talking points about how the whole thing was unfair. Everyone was happy with him. The banks, no one was hurt by his statements of financial condition. And that's what he said a lot of, where he's basically said, they made these loans, didn't matter what these statements said, they all made money from it.
Yeah, but Attorney General Letitia James said they got what they wanted.
He rambled, he hurled insults, but we expected that. At the end of the day, the documentary evidence demonstrated that, in fact, he falsely inflated his assets to basically enrich himself and his family.
And she says very apparent to the judge who makes the final decision. To that point, former prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, Jessica Roth, says a lot at stake.
And so really what remains to be decided is the amount of disgorgement of profits and also what the remedy should be in terms of perhaps permanently enjoining Trump and his family members from doing business in the state of New York.
And Trump?
To think that we're being sued and spending all this time and money, and yet people being killed all over the world, that this country could stop.
Ivanka Trump on the stand on Wednesday. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now in San Francisco. I'm Ed Baxter, and this is Bloomberg.
Well, we take a look now at some of the top business stories of the hour. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng will hold 2 days of talks in San Francisco this week. The story from Bloomberg's Joanne Wong.
The Treasury Department says Yellen and He, Beijing's top economic official, will meet on November 9th and 10th. The meeting will take place on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. The Yellen-He talks are expected to build on a series of recent visits and announcements between the two sides. They're trying to improve diplomatic and economic ties. Some of the issues likely to be addressed include U.S. export controls and Chinese military engagement in the South China Sea. The U.S. says it's not seeking to decouple from China, but rather is looking to de-risk and diversify. Chinese officials have criticized that message. In Hong Kong, I'm Joanne Wong, Bloomberg Radio.
We go to China next, and Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. Albanese is the first Australian leader to visit China in more than 7 years. The meeting may go a long way to improving diplomatic relations between the two countries. Xi told Albanese that, quote, with joint efforts on both sides, we've been resuming our exchanges and various views and worked out some problems. Albanese, meanwhile, praising the mature relationship between the two nations.
Australia, along with other countries in the region, has an interest in continued stable growth in the Chinese economy and its ongoing engagement with the world. And I believe that we can all benefit from the greater understanding that comes from high-level dialogue and people-to-people links, and that a strong relationship between our two countries will be beneficial into the future.
That is Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Overall, relations between Australia and China have improved over the past year. High-level ministerial meetings have restarted, and Chinese restrictions on imports of Australian coal, timber and barley have all been lifted. Brian.
Well, China's second biggest developer has been given a lifeline by its biggest shareholder and a local regulator. Bloomberg's Yvonne Mann has the story from Hong Kong.
China Wanke says it will repay its debts on time after getting key signals of support. Shenzhen regulator Asset Supervision and Management Commission said it has confidence in Wanke. The regulator said it will support the developer if it faces extreme conditions. The comments were made during an online meeting on Monday attended by financial institutions. Also, Wanke's largest shareholder, Shenzhen Metro Group, said it had no plans to cut its stake. Wanke dollar bonds surged as much as 12 cents, putting some on pace for record gains. The expressions of support are rare for distressed developers in China. In Singapore, I'm Yvonne Mann, Bloomberg Radio.
Decision day for the Reserve Bank of Australia. It's going to issue its monetary policy decision at 2:30 p.m. Sydney time. That's in just over 4 hours. Most economists forecasting the RBA to lift the cash rate by 25 basis points at that meeting after the third quarter CPI print came in hotter than expected. And this comes even though the RBA's lifted rates by 400 basis points since April 2022, and that is the fastest pace of tightening in the inflation targeting era. Inflation, though, proving stickier than expected. Bloomberg Economics has got an out-of-consensus call for the RBA to stay on hold at 4.1%, which it forecasts will be enough to return inflation to the 2 to 3% target band by 2025. But whatever the RBA does today, that hawkish bias going to remain in place, Brian.
Yep. Goldman Sachs is boosting pay incentives for its asset management teams. Let's get that story from Bloomberg's Ann Cates.
The changes instituted over the past several months will lift the share of profits available for teams directly responsible for the performance of Goldman's alternative investment funds. The share of performance awards usually gets divvied up between employees and the bank's own accounts. Under the new structure, investing teams will receive 40 to 50% of the pool. Goldman oversees $267 billion in fee-earning alternative assets. In Washington, Ann Cates, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, the time is 12 minutes past the hour. Oh, I wanted to mention that China Wanke did trade up 7.25% yesterday after that news emerged here in the Hong Kong market. Further details later in the program. Well, let's say good morning our time to Daniel Flatley, Bloomberg national security reporter, to talk a little bit more about some of these developments in the Gaza war. So President Biden discussing this notion of a tactical pause with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I suppose if for nothing else, I mean, it's always good to have a little pause, but if for nothing else, just to get more trucks in. I think I read that only about 24 relief trucks made it into Gaza in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, Brian, you know, these discussions are sort of ongoing, and obviously we had U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in the region earlier today. I think, you know, what Biden's pleas are running up against is Israel's desire to not give Hamas a chance to breathe, a chance to regroup, a chance to seize some initiative and maybe take the fight back toward Israel. They're really trying to, from what we've seen, Israel, is trying to sort of cordon off that northern part of Gaza, especially around Gaza City, and try to go basically house to house, street to street to try to root out some of the Hamas militants. And I think that the thinking is, at least on the Israeli side, that if you pause that operation for any significant period of time, that you only give your enemy a chance to regroup and strike back. Obviously, the U.S. feels somewhat differently about that, and I think that there's a humanitarian argument that they're trying to make to the Israelis about that. But a very complicated situation.
Yeah, and in terms of the work of going block to block, house to house, there is the issue of the tunnels as well. How is the Israeli military handling that?
Well, obviously, we know that over the last several weeks they've bombarded that area with airstrikes, artillery, other forms of heavy weaponry to sort of soften that area up, so to speak. But as you say, tunnels are underground and built that way for that purpose, to shelter from that kind of bombardment. So in terms of the tunnels, it's very hard to figure out where they are, where the locations are. Secretary of State Blinken made some comments sort of talking about, they may have looked at the tunnels issue. The U.S. may have looked at the tunnel issue to a certain extent. But I think basically what they're trying to do is, as much as possible, contain the conflict to that northern part of Gaza in order to really root out the Hamas leadership that may be sheltering in that area.
But as Ed Baxter reported a few moments ago, and as we know, the Israeli military said that it exchanged fire with Hezbollah in Lebanon along with Hamas. So it would seem that things are still in the expanding mode.
Yeah, I think that is going to continue to be the case for a long time to come. Not only is there the risk of an expanding conflict to the north, but also, we've had some strikes against U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria and other places. So, clearly there is a desire to, as Israel is Israel's enemies, I guess we could say, as Israel is getting more deeply involved in Gaza, Hezbollah and others are seeking to take advantage of that by potentially opening up another front. That hasn't happened yet to a great degree, but there's certainly some probing aspects to what they're doing there.
We've had this denial from the U.S. as well, that an Iranian report that it's seeking a ceasefire. But what sort of back channels exist between the U.S. and Iran? Can we expect that there are conversations happening?
Well, there's always some form of communication happening, especially now, considering the Biden administration prior to this recent conflict was trying to resurrect some form of nuclear deal with Iran. So I'm sure that there are diplomats that are talking back and forth on the back channel to Iran. But I think that a lot of this is playing out, obviously, in public. We had the Iranian foreign minister a couple of weeks ago talking about the potential for the conflict to expand. The U.S. is very aggressive in terms of sanctions and things that it's trying to do on Iran. So I think that there's a bit of a chess game going on here where you may have some diplomacy that's going on behind the scenes, but really a lot of tough rhetoric in order to sort of keep a lid on this conflict. Whether that will be successful in the long run, we don't know at this point.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, your morning brief on the stories making news from Hong Kong to Singapore and Wall Street.
Look for us on your podcast feed every day on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcast.
You can also listen live each day on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, SiriusXM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.